The first rays of sunlight stretched lazily across the rolling hills, brushing the tops of golden corn stalks that swayed gently in the morning breeze. It was one of those quiet, perfect mornings where the world felt still, and every leaf, every stalk seemed in its rightful place. The homeowner, a man in his mid-40s with calloused hands and a weathered face shaped by years of early mornings and long summers, walked slowly through the rows of his cornfield. His fingers brushed the tops of the plants as he checked for pests or any signs of damage from the night's dew. This was his sanctuary, his pride, a patch of land he had nurtured for years, and he treated it like an old friend, each stalk familiar, each ear of corn a small victory of patience and toil. Across the street, behind the shutters of a pristine, overly polished house, HOA Karen watched him. She leaned slightly forward, peering through the blinds with an intensity that suggested more than mere curiosity. Her expression was a curious blend of fascination and irritation, one eyebrow arched as if measuring whether the cornfield somehow offended her personal sense of order. It was the kind of look that could make even the calmest neighbor feel uneasy, a gaze that implied something far more deliberate than casual oversight. She had always had opinions, strong opinions, but lately, those opinions seemed less like preferences, and more like a checklist of battles she was determined to fight. For the homeowner, life had been simple. Wake up, tend the crops, check the fences, greet the occasional passerby, and maintain a sense of peace he valued above all. He had dealt with HOA rules before, mostly small things, trash cans slightly out of place, an overgrown bush here or there. But Karen's obsession with his cornfield had been escalating over months. Her letters were increasingly dramatic, filled with bureaucratic language and wild claims about hazards and community disruption. Yet today, something in her demeanor felt different. There was a tension in the air, subtle but unmistakable. As he reached the end of a row, his dog trotting silently at his heels, he noticed a flicker of movement across the field. A crow, perhaps, or a shadow. His mind dismissed it at first. But then he saw it again. A small wisp of smoke curling into the sky, barely visible through the dense rows of corn. He froze, heart skipping a beat, scanning the horizon. There was no fire anywhere near his equipment or his fences. He squinted, trying to determine whether it was a trick of the morning sun or something more sinister. Meanwhile, Karen was no longer behind her blinds. She had stepped out onto her manicured lawn, arms crossed, tilting her head as she watched him. The sun glinted off her oversized sunglasses, hiding the calculating glint in her eyes. To an outsider, she might have looked like any other homeowner enjoying a morning stroll, but the homeowner had learned to recognize her posture, the deliberate packing, the small, measured gestures that always preceded chaos. Something told him that whatever had been simmering between them for months was about to boil over. And yet, he didn't see her move closer. He didn't see the quick, deliberate steps that would change the day forever. He shook his head, trying to calm the uneasy feeling rising in his chest. "Just nerves," he muttered to himself, adjusting his hat against the morning sun. But the smoke had grown, subtle yet undeniable, drifting toward the southern edge of the field. He could hear the faint crackle, almost drowned by the wind rustling the cornstalks. The sound was foreign in a place that had known only the gentle whispers of leaves and the occasional crow's call. He began moving faster, weaving through the stalks, his boots crunching softly against the soil, every sense alert. The smell of smoke grew stronger, sharp and acrid against the fresh scent of corn. Karen, at the same time, retreated just slightly behind a tree, her face hidden but her eyes tracking every movement. She wasn't in a hurry, there was no panicked energy, no outward sign of guilt. It was controlled, precise. Watching her, it was clear that she was waiting for something to unfold, something only she could orchestrate. Her quiet confidence contrasted sharply with the tension that now gripped the homeowner, whose mind raced with questions. Was this a natural fire? A lightning strike? Or had Karen finally decided to act on the months of gripes and threats she had voiced at the last HOA meeting? As he approached the edge of the smoke, he realized how quickly it was spreading. The sun reflected off the curling orange and gray tendrils, making them appear almost alive, slithering through the green and gold of his cornfield. Panic began to rise, but he forced himself to think clearly. Water hoses were hooked up to his small pump, buckets lined up near the edge, and his instincts as someone who had faced storms, droughts, and pests kicked in. He began dousing the edges, but the smoke thickened, and the fire advanced faster than anticipated. The distant sound of the dog barking added another layer of tension, a warning that the danger was closer than he imagined. The homeowner's mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. He thought of neighbors, of insurance, of the fields he had spent years cultivating. And in the back of his mind, he couldn't ignore the shadow of HOA Karen, still watching, still calculating. Something told him that this wasn't an accident. Something told him that today the battle lines had been drawn, and he was standing in the center of them. And as the smoke twisted into the morning sky, he realized he had only one choice: confront the fire and whatever or whoever had set it in motion. The camera or narration lingers on the two figures, the homeowner amid rising smoke, his face a mixture of fear and determination, and Karen, almost ghost-like behind the tree line, her intentions as murky as the curling smoke. The stage is set. Tension hangs heavy, and every second feels like it could erupt into chaos. The audience is left on edge, knowing the calm is over and the story has only just begun. The next morning dawned hot and humid, a sticky layer settling over the cornfield that made every step feel heavier than the last. The homeowner was already at work, inspecting the edges of the field, making sure the stalks were healthy and upright. The previous day's smoke had left an uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach, one that refused to fade. He couldn't shake the thought of HOA Karen's lurking presence. She had been quiet all morning, or so it seemed, but he knew better than to underestimate her. By mid-morning, Karen appeared again, striding down her pristine driveway as though the neighborhood were a stage and she the star of some unwritten drama. She carried a stack of papers, each one marked with official-looking HOA stamps and headers, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The homeowner paused, watching her approach. Her face was carefully composed, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Yet there was something in the tilt of her head, in the precise, almost mechanical way she moved, that sent a shiver down his spine. She had a plan, he could feel it, and it had nothing to do with community aesthetics. "Good morning," she called, voice sweet but laced with a subtle venom. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I just wanted to talk about your field." She gestured broadly toward the corn, as if the towering stalks were a crime scene rather than a source of pride. The homeowner forced a smile, though his gut twisted with unease. "Morning, Karen. Everything seems fine here. The corn's growing well." Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is it, though? You see, I've been measuring, and some of these stalks are excessive. Hazardous, even. Couldn't someone trip? Or worse?" She let her words hang in the air, her smile never faltering, though the threat was unmistakable. The homeowner took a slow step back, adjusting the brim of his hat. "I take care of the field, Karen. Nothing like that is going to happen. You've got nothing to worry about." But Karen wasn't done. She produced a small tape measure from her purse, brandishing it like a weapon. "I've been very patient, you know. I've tried to be reasonable, but there are rules, and rules are rules, and you are testing the limits of patience." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, almost theatrical in its menace. For a brief moment, the homeowner considered calling the HOA or even the local sheriff. Karen had a reputation for escalating petty grievances into official complaints, but he dismissed the thought. He had dealt with her before. He knew that involving authorities only fed her sense of self-importance. Instead, he watched her leave, heels clicking back up her driveway, a strange satisfaction in her stride. Yet as he turned back to his corn, an uneasy feeling settled in his chest. The afternoon brought an unusual quiet, the kind that presses on the ears and heightens the senses. Birds were still, the wind barely rustled the leaves, and the sun hung heavy overhead. And then it happened, a subtle but unmistakable smell, faint at first, almost swallowed by the summer heat. Smoke. The homeowner froze, scanning the horizon, heart-hammering. He traced the scent to the far corner of his cornfield, a section farthest from the road where the stalks bent in the gentle breeze. There he saw a thin wisp curling upward, delicate and almost teasing in its movement. His stomach dropped. It wasn't an accident. Someone had been here. By the time he reached the spot, the smoke had grown slightly thicker, tendrils licking the bases of the stalks. His heart raced as he realized just how fast things could go wrong in a dry, sun-baked field. He reached for the nearest bucket, starting to douse the small flames before they spread, but it was like trying to hold back a tide with a cup. From the corner of his eye, he spotted movement across the street. Karen stood at the edge of her lawn, arms crossed, her posture impossibly still, her gaze fixed intently on him. She wasn't running. She wasn't panicked. She was watching, waiting, and for a split second it felt as if the smoke itself was a signal she had been waiting for all along. The homeowner clenched his jaw, adrenaline pumping. "Not today," he muttered under his breath, splashing water on the stubborn flames. But even as he fought the small fire, he couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of being targeted. Someone had crossed a line, and he knew exactly who it was. By evening, the fire had been contained, but only barely. The soil smelled of scorched corn, and the blackened tips of the stalks stood as silent warnings. Neighbors murmured from their yards, exchanging glances, sensing the tension that hung over the field like a storm cloud. And somewhere in the distance, HOA Karen retreated behind the shade of her porch, a slight smirk on her face. She hadn't acted recklessly, she had acted with precision. The homeowner knew this wasn't over. The smoke had been more than a warning. It had been the opening move in a game he hadn't agreed to play. And as the sun sank low, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, he realized that what had started as a peaceful morning walk through his cornfield had become the first act in a battle that was far from finished. He straightened his hat, glancing toward the silhouette of Karen's house. Every instinct screamed that things were about to escalate, and he would need every ounce of patience, cunning, and strength to protect what was his. The cornfield was more than crops. It was pride, history, and a quiet life he refused to surrender. And Karen, well, she had just thrown the first match. The morning air was thick with heat and tension. The homeowner had barely slept, his mind restless with the image of smoke curling through his precious cornfield. He walked the rows again, boots sinking slightly into the dark, fertile soil, checking for any signs of trouble. But the uneasy calm of the previous evening had shifted. Something felt off. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call seemed sharper, more urgent, as if the land itself was warning him. Then he saw it, a wisp of smoke, faint but unmistakable, rising from the center of the field. His heart clenched. This wasn't a leftover ember from yesterday. This was new, deliberate. Someone had returned. The homeowner sprinted toward the smoke, dodging the tall stalks as the smell of burning corn grew stronger. His lungs filled with acrid, sharp air, and he coughed, waving his hand to clear the smoke from his eyes. Flames were licking at the dry leaves, spreading faster than they should have in such a small patch. Panic surged, but he forced himself to think clearly. Buckets of water, hoses, makeshift barriers. He grabbed everything at hand, splashing water on the growing fire, but it was relentless. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Across the street, HOA Karen was there, a silhouette framed against the morning sun, unnervingly calm. Her arms were folded, and she seemed almost detached from the chaos erupting just yards away. Her eyes followed him intently, a quiet smirk playing at the corner of her lips. Every instinct screamed at him. She was behind this. She had crossed the line. The flames roared higher, consuming dry stalks in a wall of heat and smoke. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the smell and the rising panic. Some filmed on their phones, faces pale, whispering to one another about what kind of person could watch a cornfield burn and not act. But Karen did not flinch. She simply observed, her expression unreadable, almost theatrical in its calmness. The homeowner's dog barked frantically, circling near the edge of the field, its fur bristling. He grabbed the leash and pulled the animal back, aware that even a small spark could become uncontrollable. The wind had picked up, carrying flames dangerously close to his equipment shed, where his tools and seed supplies were stored. Every second counted, and the fire was moving too fast for him to fight alone. Then came the sound he had been dreading, the roar of engines and sirens in the distance. Firefighters were arriving. The homeowner felt a surge of relief, tempered by a twist of dread. He knew this was far from over. Karen, however, did not seem concerned. She remained at the edge of her lawn, hands on her hips, observing as if the drama were a stage play and she were the director. The firefighters leapt into action, hoses unspooling, trucks maneuvering skillfully between the rows. Water hissed against the flames, steam rising in thick clouds, but the fire had already claimed a large patch of corn. The homeowner joined them, giving directions, moving with precision born of years of hard work on the land. Each spray of water, each shouted command felt like a battle in miniature. Control versus chaos, patience versus recklessness. Corinne's presence was almost ghost-like, her eyes fixed on the scene, calculating. She didn't move to help, didn't call for assistance, she watched. And the audience, seeing her poised and unbothered, feels a deep, simmering suspense. What is she planning next? Has the fire been just a warning, or is it a calculated act of destruction? As the flames finally began to yield to the relentless assault of water, investigators quietly arrived on the scene. They moved through the crowd, assessing damage, taking notes, and asking neighbors for observations. Every movement, every question added another layer of tension. Corinne remained in view, careful to keep her composure, but the homeowner noticed the slightest flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The smoke had cleared just enough to reveal the small, burned patches, evidence that someone had intended damage, and all signs pointed toward her. The neighbors murmured amongst themselves, the tension thick in the air. Some whispered warnings to the homeowner, others shook their heads in disbelief at Corinne's calmness. A few brave souls approached the edge of the charred field, documenting the aftermath with their phones. The homeowner, exhausted, wiped sweat from his brow and watched the scene unfold. Relief mingled with frustration. The field had survived, but barely. And Corinne's intentions were now unmistakable, visible to anyone paying attention. By the time the firefighters began packing up, the smell of smoke lingered, a pungent reminder of how close things had come to disaster. The homeowner surveyed the field, the scorched earth standing out against the untouched golden corn, and his heart sank. This was not just about property, it was about respect, pride, and the thin line between civility and chaos. And Corinne, poised across the street, seemed to embody that line perfectly. As he turned to leave, she waved casually from her porch, a gesture that felt both mocking and oddly triumphant. The homeowner clenched his fists, a storm of anger and determination brewing inside him. The first fire had been a warning. The second, though barely started, had tested his resolve. And he knew he would need more than hoses, buckets, and sweat to defend what was his. The next move in this battle was inevitable, and the audience is left hanging, breath caught, wondering what Corinne might do next and how far the homeowner will go to protect his cornfield. The aftermath of the fire left the cornfield smelling of smoke and scorched earth, but the worst had been contained for now. The homeowner wiped sweat from his brow, muscles aching from hours of battling the flames, but there was no time to relax. Across the street, HOA Corinne stood on her porch, sunglasses perched perfectly, watching every movement with an unsettling calm. Her presence was a silent challenge, and the homeowner could feel it even from a distance. By mid-morning, investigators began arriving. Official vehicles pulled into the neighborhood, lights flashing, papers rustling. The homeowner watched as they moved carefully through the charred remains, photographing, taking notes, asking neighbors questions. The tension was palpable. Every glance Corinne cast toward them was measured, deliberate. She smiled politely at a passing neighbor, but her eyes flickered toward the cornfield, the smoke, and finally the homeowner himself. There was no panic in her movements, only calculation. The homeowner took a deep breath and approached the investigators. "I'm the property owner," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I can show you the damage, the areas where the fire started, and anything that might help figure out what happened." His gaze flicked toward Corinne, who seemed almost immune to the scrutiny around her. That only fueled his determination. As he led the investigators through the burnt patches, a faint sense of dread crept over him. He remembered the subtle movements of Corinne the day before, the way she had lingered near the edge of his property. The pieces began to fit together in a way that was chilling. The investigators listened intently, scribbling notes, occasionally raising questions. "Did anyone see anyone around here yesterday afternoon?" one asked. "Did anyone notice unusual activity?" A few neighbors stepped forward hesitantly, exchanging nervous glances. One mentioned seeing Corinne near the field during the late morning, fiddling with what looked like a lighter or small tool. Another recalled the way she had paced along her property line, her attention entirely focused on the corn. Each new account added tension to the scene. The homeowner could feel the pressure mounting, knowing that soon the investigation would point squarely at her. Meanwhile, Corinne had retreated inside her house, or so it seemed. But her eyes remained fixed on the property from the window, and the homeowner caught glimpses of her movement, packing back and forth, hands clasped tightly, muttering under her breath. She had always been confident, always believed she could manipulate any situation to her favor. But now, the fire, the investigators, and the growing evidence were turning her confidence into something fragile, something tense. The homeowner surveyed the damage with a mix of frustration and relief. Sections of his cornfield were blackened, but most of the stalks remained standing, swaying gently as if mocking the chaos that had erupted. He knelt by a particularly charred patch, tracing the edges with his fingers. Whoever had started this had done so deliberately, carefully. That realization fueled a quiet fire within him, not anger exactly, but determination. Corinne's actions could not go unchallenged. As the sun climbed higher, the scene took on a cinematic quality. Smoke still lingering in the air, golden corn stalks standing stark against the blackened patches, neighbors whispering in hushed tones, and investigators methodically documenting everything. Corinne remained a silent figure in the background, watching, calculating, and waiting for the right moment to act, or perhaps to deny responsibility altogether. The suspense was unbearable, a taut wire stretching between accusation and action. The homeowner straightened and looked back toward Corinne's house. She had always been meticulous about appearances, controlling her environment, controlling the narrative. But the fire, the evidence, and the witnesses had created a variable she could not manage. The tension was no longer one-sided. The homeowner felt it in the air, felt it in the eyes of the neighbors around him. This was more than a property dispute. It was a test of character, a battle of wits, and the stakes had never been higher. By late afternoon, the investigators began asking more pointed questions, nodding the proximity of Corinne's property to the origin of the fire, comparing statements from neighbors, and photographing every discarded item or suspicious mark near the burnt patches. The homeowner kept a careful distance, observing but not interfering, knowing that each moment was critical. Corinne's calm facade began to falter, if only subtly, as she realized that the fire she had orchestrated, or at least influenced, was now under scrutiny. The homeowner took a moment to breathe, feeling the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. He glanced around the cornfield, imagining the possible scenarios, the next moves Corinne might make, and the way the neighborhood watched in suspense. Every second felt charged with anticipation. The audience can almost feel the heat, smell the smoke, and sense the silent, dangerous tension between homeowner and HOA Corinne. As the investigators packed up for the day, the homeowner knew this was only the beginning. Corinne's next move was inevitable, and the suspense hung like a cloud over the field. He would need strategy, patience, and courage to face what was coming, and the audience is left on edge, waiting, wondering just how far Corinne would go and how he would respond. The next morning, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. The cornfield still smelled faintly of smoke, and the charred patches gleamed under the sun like dark scars. The homeowner moved carefully among the rows, his boots crunching softly on the dry soil. Each step reminded him of the fire's fury, of how close it had come to consuming everything he had worked for. But more than the physical damage, his mind lingered on HOA Corinne, the quiet storm across the street, whose calm exterior masked something far more dangerous. By mid-morning, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered along the perimeter of the field, murmuring among themselves. The homeowner noticed the subtle shift in their demeanor, curiosity mixed with disbelief, some even amusement. Corinne had a reputation for theatrics, but the fire had pushed the envelope. It wasn't just annoyance or entitlement anymore. It was an act that endangered property and potentially lives. The homeowner approached a neighbor who had a security camera pointed toward the cornfield. "Did you get anything useful?" he asked quietly. The neighbor hesitated, then handed over a memory card. "You might want to see this before anyone else," they said. The homeowner felt a chill run down his spine as he inserted it into his tablet. The footage played, and there it was. HOA Corinne, near the far edge of the cornfield, carrying a small lighter and a suspicious-looking object, her movements deliberate and calculated. He sat back, absorbing what he saw. The footage was clear, damning, and undeniable. Corinne's smirk, the slow, measured way she approached the edge of the field, even the glances over her shoulder, all of it screamed intent. This wasn't an accident, nor was it negligence. It was planned, and now the proof was in his hands. A surge of determination coursed through him. It was time to confront the truth, to make sure the right people knew exactly what had happened. He gathered the footage, notes, and statements from neighbors and approached the local authorities. The investigators, already familiar with the field and the previous day's events, watched the video intently. "This is significant," one of them said, tapping the screen. "It clearly shows someone on the property at the time. Do you recognize them?" The homeowner didn't need to answer. The evidence spoke for itself. Meanwhile, across the street, Karen sat in her home office, ostensibly busy with paperwork, though her focus was elsewhere. She glanced up at the sound of sirens in the distance, though she was careful not to let her panic show. The homeowner had taken steps, and now the investigation was closing in. She had always believed she could manipulate situations to her advantage, but this time the cards were stacked against her. The investigators returned to the cornfield with the homeowner, photographing the blackened stalks, examining the edges where the fire had started, and comparing them with the video evidence. Every step, every click of a camera shutter heightened the tension, like the slow tightening of a vise. Karen, aware that the homeowner was coordinating with authorities, remained silent, her eyes sharp, calculating. The suspense hung thick in the air. Would she admit anything? Would she attempt to deny the undeniable? The homeowner felt a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. Satisfaction because justice was moving closer, apprehension because he knew Karen's nature. She was clever, manipulative, and unlikely to go down without trying some form of retaliation. Yet the evidence was clear. The fire had been deliberate, and Karen's fingerprints, both literal and metaphorical, were all over it. Word spread through the neighborhood quickly. Conversations in driveways, whispered exchanges by fences, and cautious nods of acknowledgement painted a picture of growing awareness. Karen's calm facade began to crack in subtle ways. A furrowed brow, a hand wringing a piece of paper, a glance that lingered too long toward the field. Her usual composure was faltering, and the homeowner watched quietly, letting the suspense build naturally. By late afternoon, the investigators had compiled enough evidence to approach Karen. They arrived at her doorstep with a professional calm, not showing urgency but carrying the weight of inevitability. Karen answered, carefully composed, her smile in place, but her hands betrayed a faint tremor. The homeowner watched from a distance, tense but resolute. The moment had come for the confrontation, and every second stretched, thick with suspense. The investigators presented the evidence methodically. The video, neighbor statements, and the remnants of materials found near the origin of the fire. Karen's polite expressions wavered, subtle cracks appearing in the armor she had worn so well for months. She opened her mouth, attempted to speak, and paused, the words caught somewhere between denial and realization. The tension was electric, a mix of anticipation and inevitability. The audience can feel it, the quiet before a storm, the edge of chaos about to tip into resolution. The homeowner allowed himself a slow exhale. He had fought the flames, endured the smoke, and now watched the consequences of Karen's actions begin to unfold. But he knew the story wasn't over. The evidence had set the stage for accountability, yet the real test was still to come. How Karen would respond under pressure, and whether she would finally face the truth of what she had done. The suspense lingered, thick and unrelenting, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the cornfield and hinting at the dramatic confrontations yet to come. The next morning, the tension that had been simmering for days reached a boiling point. Across the street, HOA Karen's carefully maintained composure began to crack. She had spent countless hours projecting control, appearing calm, unflappable, untouchable. But now, with investigators standing at her doorstep and evidence pointing squarely at her, the mask was slipping. The homeowner watched from the edge of his property, heart pounding. He knew the confrontation was inevitable, and every instinct told him to stay back. But he also felt a surge of anticipation. This was the moment all the warnings, the smoke, and the charred stalks had led to. Karen's fate, it seemed, would be decided in the quiet tension of her living room, with the authorities closing in. The investigators moved with deliberate professionalism, approaching Karen's door with a calm that belied the drama about to unfold. They knocked sharply, the sound echoing across the quiet neighborhood. Karen answered, sunglasses perched on her face, arms crossed, lips curved in a practiced smile. At first glance, she seemed unshaken, but the slight tremor in her fingers betrayed her nerves. "Good morning, Ms. Karen," one of the investigators began, holding a folder that bulged with evidence. "We'd like to discuss the events at the cornfield yesterday and review some observations and recordings we've collected." Corinne's smile faltered ever so slightly. I don't understand what this is about, she said, voice steady but tight. Everything at that field was completely fine, absolutely no issues. The lead investigator leaned forward, opening the folder and sliding a series of photographs and video stills onto the table. We have multiple neighbor statements, security footage, and physical evidence from the scene. It all points to someone near the origin of the fire shortly before it began. Do you recognize this? Corinne's eyes flickered over the images. The homeowner standing just out of sight in his yard could see the subtle changes in her expression. Her carefully constructed confidence was faltering. The smirk vanished. Her hands shifted, fiddling with the hem of her blouse, a clear sign that she felt the walls closing in. I don't know how that could be, she stammered, voice rising slightly, betraying panic beneath the calm facade. That's impossible. I wasn't anywhere near. You were, the investigator interrupted gently but firmly. We have timestamps, footage, and witness accounts. It's all consistent. The homeowner felt a quiet satisfaction. This was more than personal vindication. It was proof that accountability could not be avoided. But even as Corinne faltered, the suspense thickened. She wasn't a person to give up easily. Her reputation for manipulation and theatrics meant that she might try another desperate move, and every second felt like waiting for a spark to ignite chaos. Corinne's eyes darted nervously around the room, then back to the folder. Her mind raced, weighing options. Deny, deflect, or fabricate, any of them might have worked in a smaller dispute, but the mounting evidence was a tidal wave she could not escape. The tension in the room was palpable, a cinematic moment suspended in time. The investigator continued, methodically walking her through the evidence. The fire caused significant damage. It endangered property and could have endangered lives. We're giving you a chance to explain before further action is taken. Corinne's composure finally shattered. Her voice rose, no longer hiding panic. I didn't mean for it to get that. I was just... You were just what? The investigator pressed, voice firm. Setting fire to someone else's property, watching it spread, because that's exactly what the evidence shows. The homeowner, still outside, watched with bated breath. He felt a mix of vindication and unease. The field had survived, but the confrontation revealed Corinne's true nature in stark detail. Every observer, every neighbor peering from their windows or yards, could see the drama unfolding. An ordinary property dispute transformed into a suspenseful clash of character and consequence. Corinne sank into a chair, hands covering her face briefly, the veneer of superiority completely gone. The investigators spoke quietly now, outlining the next steps: official citations, potential legal action, and recommendations for restitution. The homeowner listened, muscles tense, as the process unfolded. The suspense didn't come from physical danger anymore. It came from watching justice finally reach someone who had been so reckless, so brazen for so long. Finally, Corinne sat back, eyes downcast, shoulders slumping. She had faced the consequences she had tried to avoid, and the homeowner felt the subtle thrill of resolution creeping in. Yet there was still a shadow of uncertainty. The neighborhood had seen her unravel, and while the immediate threat was over, the echoes of her actions would linger. The suspense, now transformed into a tense relief, held everyone on edge. How would the community respond? Would she truly learn from this, or merely scheme anew? The homeowner exhaled slowly, glancing back at the field. The charred stalks were still visible, but the bulk of the corn remained standing. He had fought the flames, endured the stress, and now watched as Corinne faced the consequences of her obsession. The audience feels the payoff of suspense, the tension of confrontation resolved, but still lingering just enough to hint at future drama. As the investigators left, Corinne sat silently, a defeated figure framed by the afternoon light streaming through her living room windows. The homeowner turned back to his cornfield, muscles relaxing for the first time in days, yet eyes still scanning the horizon. He knew the battle wasn't over in a broader sense. Neighborhood conflicts never truly end. But today, victory had a clear face: accountability, resilience, and the quiet satisfaction of a life defended. The neighborhood had changed in subtle ways over the past few days. Whispers followed Corinne wherever she went, polite nods from neighbors mixed with wary glances. The homeowner, meanwhile, moved through his cornfield with a quiet satisfaction, though he remained vigilant. The fire had been contained, the investigation underway and Karen's manipulation finally exposed. But in a community like theirs, the ripple effects of chaos lingered longer than the flames. Karen had retreated indoors, her daily routines now overshadowed by a creeping tension. Each phone call, each knock at the door was met with careful calculation. She knew that the evidence could lead to fines, legal action, and a permanent stain on her reputation. The once perfect mask of control was now cracked, the audience watching her unravel with a mix of suspense and vindication. The homeowner focused on the field, inspecting the recovered stalks, clearing debris, and tending to scorched soil. Every movement reminded him of the battle he had endured, not just against flames, but against someone who had tried to undermine his peace and livelihood. And yet, the adrenaline of the confrontation still lingered, a quiet hum in the background, keeping him alert. Late that afternoon, the doorbell rang. The homeowner approached cautiously, aware that Karen might attempt one last act of defiance. But it wasn't her. It was a city inspector accompanied by a firefighter. They carried official forms, documenting Karen's culpability and outlining required restitution. These documents officially note that the fire was deliberately set and caused significant damage, one said. She will be accountable for all costs related to containment, repair, and any potential fines. The homeowner nodded, feeling a surge of relief. Justice, slow as it often is, was finally catching up, and somewhere across the street, Karen could see the process unfolding, powerless to stop it. The suspense had shifted. The danger was gone, but the anticipation of consequences, both social and legal, now hung over her like a storm cloud. Neighbors began to emerge, drawn by the ongoing proceedings. Murmurs of approval, of quiet satisfaction spread across lawns and porches. Finally, someone whispered, "She can't get away with this anymore." Another nodded, filming discreetly on their phone. The homeowner stayed in the shadows, watching the reactions unfold. It wasn't vengeance he sought, it was restoration, a return to normalcy after chaos threatened his livelihood. Karen, however, was not yet done with her theatrics. She attempted to defend herself in muted conversations with inspectors, her voice occasionally rising in frustration. "It wasn't intentional," she insisted, though the evidence and witness accounts spoke louder than any words. The homeowner, hearing about her attempts from neighbors, allowed himself a quiet smirk. The tension had shifted, and now the suspense came from watching how far she would go to salvage her image, and whether the community's patience would finally run out. By evening, the homeowner returned to the cornfield, walking slowly through the rows of golden stalks. He ran his hands along the edges where blackened stalks had stood as silent testimony to Karen's reckless obsession. The corn had survived, stronger than ever, a symbol not just of his work, but of resilience against interference and chaos. The audience can feel the shift. What once was fear and suspense now mixes with relief and quiet triumph, though the potential for tension still lingers in the background. He paused, looking across the street at Karen's house. Her windows were drawn, the blinds tightly shut, a stark contrast to the openness of his cornfield. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the rows, painting the scene in cinematic oranges and golds. It was a moment of reflection, of understanding the weight of what had happened and what could still happen. The community's reaction continued to build momentum. Neighbors began sharing stories, recounting Karen's escalating obsession with the cornfield, piecing together months of small annoyances that had led to deliberate action. The homeowner realized that what had started as a personal battle had evolved into a lesson for everyone. Accountability matters, even when someone believes themselves untouchable. As night fell, the field was quiet once more. The lingering scent of smoke had faded, replaced by the earthy aroma of summer corn. The homeowner stood at the edge of the field, looking out over his land, and allowed himself a deep breath. Karen had been exposed. Justice was in motion. And yet the tension of uncertainty, the kind that kept an audience on edge, remained just enough to remind everyone that peace, even when restored, is fragile. For the first time in days, the homeowner felt a sense of control return. The field was his, the damage repaired or documented, and the community aware of the truth. Karen could rage, deny, or manipulate all she wanted, but the weight of evidence, the scrutiny of neighbors, and the undeniable courage of one determined homeowner had shifted the balance. Suspense had transformed into triumph, drama into resolution, though the story still held a whisper of tension, a reminder of how close chaos had come. And as the camera, or narration, lingers on the rows of golden corn stretching into the horizon under a deepening twilight, the audience is left with a sense of awe. A battle fought not with brute force alone, but with patience, courage, and resilience. The final act looms, Karen's ultimate consequences and the homeowner's restored peace, waiting to be revealed. The morning sun rose over the cornfield, casting long, golden beams across the rows of resilient stalks. The homeowner stood at the edge, surveying his land with a quiet sense of triumph. After days of smoke, chaos, and tension, the field had survived, stronger and more vibrant than ever. Every stalk seemed to sway with purpose, a living testament to his patience, diligence, and unshakable resolve. Across the street, HOA Karen's house was eerily silent. Word had spread quickly. The evidence of her actions had been documented, official citations were issued, and the community's awareness of her reckless behavior had grown. She had spent days trying to salvage her image, trying to manipulate the narrative, but the truth was inescapable. The homeowner knew that this was the final chapter. Her last chance to reclaim control had passed. Later that morning, investigators and city officials arrived at Karen's door once more, accompanied by the local fire marshal. They carried detailed reports, fines, and notices of mandatory restitution. Karen opened the door, her face pale, hands trembling slightly. The homeowner watched from his porch, tension still in the air but underlined by a growing sense of justice. "This notice officially holds you accountable for the deliberate fire set on the cornfield," the fire marshal said firmly, placing the documents in her hands. "You are responsible for the damage, any costs incurred by emergency services, and compliance with restitution measures." Karen's carefully curated composure shattered. Her voice wavered as she attempted to argue, but every objection was met with cold, undeniable evidence: the security footage, neighbor statements, and the charred remnants of her handiwork. For the first time, she felt the weight of consequence. The homeowner allowed himself a small, private smile. Justice, long overdue, was finally being delivered. Word of Karen's downfall spread rapidly through the neighborhood. Neighbors, previously wary of confrontation, began sharing stories, recounting incidents that had gone unnoticed, small but persistent signs of her obsession with controlling the community. Conversations that had once been quiet now carried a new energy, vindication, relief, and a touch of amusement at the lengths she had gone. The homeowner remained humble, aware that the real victory was not in humiliation, but in preserving what he loved most: his land and his peace of mind. By midday, Karen had retreated indoors, blinds drawn tightly, her world reduced to the uncomfortable reality of fines, citations, and the knowledge that her reputation had crumbled. Across the street, the homeowner walked his field slowly, letting the wind brush across the golden corn. Each stalk was a symbol of endurance, each row a testament to what could be accomplished with calm determination and unwavering resolve. Neighbors waved and nodded as they passed, their expressions a mix of respect and gratitude. The homeowner understood their subtle acknowledgement. He had not only defended his property, but also reminded the community that recklessness and entitlement could not prevail when met with courage and integrity. The audience, watching this unfold, feels the full arc of suspense, drama, and resolution. Tension transformed into triumph, conflict into clarity. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a cinematic glow over the field, the homeowner paused at the far edge, looking back toward Karen's house. The fire had been a test, not just of property, but of character, patience, and resilience. And the outcome was undeniable. One person's reckless actions could be challenged, confronted, and held accountable. He turned back to the cornfield, breathing in the earthy scent of summer crops, feeling a sense of peace that had been hard-won. The drama had ended, the suspense resolved, but the story lingered as a lesson for all who might try to overstep boundaries. Every neighbor, every viewer could sense the satisfaction of justice, the thrill of suspense, and the humor in watching a self-important HOA member finally face consequences she could not control. Finally, the homeowner looked straight into the camera, or for a narrative directly addressed the audience. "This is what happens when someone crosses the line," he said, voice calm but firm. Stand your ground, protect what's yours, and never underestimate the power of evidence, patience, and a community that cares. Don't let anyone set fire to your hard work, literally or figuratively. Share this story, stay vigilant, and always defend what matters most. As twilight fell, the golden corn swayed gently in the breeze, the field safe once more. Corinne's influence had ended, her antics exposed, and the homeowner's legacy preserved. The cinematic scene, the quiet field, the lingering light, and the triumphant figure standing among the stalks, captured the perfect conclusion to a battle of wills, a fight for justice, and the suspenseful drama that had kept the audience on the edge of their seats. The camera pans one last time across the field, and the story ends on a note of triumph, resilience, and satisfaction. An invitation to viewers to stay engaged, learn from the tale, and recognize that even the most audacious challenges can be met with courage, strategy, and patience. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.